She wasn't supposed to hear it. She had simply followed the sound of her husband's voice, quiet, controlled, the voice of a man not used to being overheard, down a long corridor lit only by candlelight. She stopped just outside the door to the east drawing room. 2 inches of carved mahogany between her and the man she had married 4 months ago. And through that door, she heard him. Lo, let this land. 7 words. That was all it took. 7 words, spoken in a low voice to no one she could see, and the entire shape of Clara Blackthorne's life shifted beneath her feet like the floor of a ship meeting a wave. She's just a replacement. She pressed her palm flat against the cold stone wall to keep herself standing. The candlelight flickered. Somewhere deep in the castle, a clock was ticking. Through the gap beneath the door, she could see the warm glow of a fireplace, and the long shadow of a man standing still. Absolutely still. Staring at something she could not see. She didn't go in. She turned. 1 step. Then another. Her silk slippers made no sound on the stone, and she floated back down the corridor the way a ghost floats, quietly, and without anyone noticing she had ever been there at all. But who was he talking about? Who was the woman in that room that she couldn't see? And what, exactly, had she been chosen to replace? To answer that, we have to go back. 3 years earlier. To a small, cold drawing room in a house that was running out of time. The Ashford estate had not always been so quiet. Clara remembered when this house smelled like her father's pipe smoke and her mother's lavender perfume and fresh bread from the kitchen, all 3 layered together like the pages of a book you never want to close. Now it smelled like dust. And debt. She was 22 years old and had spent the past year watching her family come undone, thread by thread. Her father's bad investments. Her brother's gambling. A drought that stripped the tenant farms bare. A creditor's letter that arrived every single Tuesday with the mechanical cruelty of a clock that cannot be stopped. She was pouring tea when the steward arrived. His name was Mr. Hollis. A precise man with thin lips and a coat that was far too fine for someone without a title. He sat across from her father, placed a single document on the table between them, and spoke in the measured tone of someone delivering news they have practiced delivering. His Grace, the Duke of Blackthorne, had expressed an interest in a formal arrangement. A marriage. To a woman of suitable character and quiet disposition. Her father went completely still. Her mother pressed a handkerchief to her mouth in the doorway. And Clara set down her teacup and looked at Mr. Hollis and said, "What does the Duke require in return?" Mr. Hollis looked at her for the first time since entering the room. Something flickered in his expression. Something she couldn't quite name. "All debts," he said. "Every creditor. Every lien. Every outstanding obligation against the Ashford name, settled within 30 days of the wedding." Clara looked at the document on the table. Then at her mother's red-rimmed eyes. Then at the window, where the garden had gone brown and dry and the fountain had been empty for 2 winters. She had a choice. Or she thought she did. For about 3 seconds. Then she told Mr. Hollis she would need a week to prepare. He said the Duke had instructed him to say, 3 days. He left. Clara picked up her teacup. Her hand was perfectly steady. She was rather proud of that. But as she watched his carriage disappear down the lane that evening, she noticed something that would bother her for months. When she agreed, Mr. Hollis didn't look relieved. He looked sorry. The carriage ride took 6 hours. Clara spent the first 2 reviewing a small leather notebook she had brought, practical things written in her neat hand. The staff hierarchy. Questions she intended to ask. What she knew of the Duke's estate. She was the sort of woman who made lists not because she was anxious, but because she believed that order was its own form of courage. She spent the last 4 hours staring out the window at a countryside that grew darker and more severe with every mile. Blackthorne Castle appeared at the end of a long curved drive lined with ancient yew trees, dark, clipped into rigid shapes, standing like soldiers who had forgotten what they were guarding. The castle itself was enormous. Not beautiful in the way of fairy tales. Beautiful the way a storm is beautiful, vast, and cold, and completely indifferent to whether you found it so. The carriage stopped. A footman opened the door. No one came to greet her. No husband waiting on the steps. No welcoming committee. Just the housekeeper, a tall, silver-haired woman named Mrs. Fenwick, who descended the front steps with the expression of someone completing a task they hadn't asked to be assigned. "Her Grace," she said. "His Grace sends his regrets. He is occupied with estate business and will join you for dinner. If you'll follow me." Clara followed. She counted the rooms they passed through. 11, before they reached her chambers. She noticed the dust covers still on 2 of the chairs. She noticed the way the maids looked at her as she passed, not with curiosity, which she had expected, but with something more complicated. Something that looked, uncomfortably, like pity. At dinner, the Duke arrived precisely on time. His name was Edmund Blackthorne. He was 31, dark-haired, quietly handsome in the way of men who have genuinely never thought about whether they were handsome. He sat across from her at a table long enough to seat 30 guests and spoke with precise, impersonal courtesy, the way one speaks to a valued employee. He asked her 3 questions. Was the journey comfortable? Were her rooms satisfactory? Did she have dietary preferences the kitchen should know about? She answered all 3. She asked him nothing. She sensed he preferred it that way. Clara was practical, but she was not incurious. And Blackthorne Castle had secrets the way all old houses do, in the stuck drawers and the rooms no one mentions and the doors that open onto staircases the housekeeper has never offered to show you. She found the east wing by accident, 10 days after her arrival. She had been looking for the real library, not the formal one with its untouched leather spines arranged by color, and had taken a wrong turn down a corridor she hadn't explored yet. The door at the end was locked, but not with any great conviction. The lock was old. The key was in it. She turned it. The room beyond was cold, colder than the corridor, as if the air inside had been sealed away for years and had simply stopped moving. Dust motes hung suspended in a shaft of gray light falling through a window too dirty to be transparent. Clara stepped inside, and then she saw her. The portrait was massive, floor to ceiling, mounted on the far wall, facing the door as if she had been waiting for someone to come in. A woman in ivory silk, dark-haired, standing in a garden Clara didn't recognize. Her expression was serene. Her posture was perfect. Her eyes were dark and slightly too knowing for the softness of the rest of her face. Clara stood very still for a long time, because the woman in the portrait was not her. The nose was different. The jaw slightly stronger. The set of the shoulders carrying a confidence that Clara, who had learned quietness as a survival skill, had never quite possessed. But if you stood at a distance, in poor light, without looking too carefully, she could have been me. Clara heard footsteps in the corridor. She stepped back out, pulled the door closed behind her, and stood in the dim hall with her hands still on the handle and her heart doing something complicated in her chest. There was something in this house that she had not been told about. Something that began with that face, and ended somewhere she hadn't found yet. Clara began asking questions. Not directly, she was too careful for that. She asked through observation, through listening, through the particular patience of a woman who has learned that people reveal far more when they believe you are not paying attention. It was the under-housemaid, Agnes, who gave her the name. Not deliberately. Agnes was 17 and chattered the way young people do when silence made them uncomfortable. She was dusting the mantel in Clara's sitting room, and Clara was reading, and it happened the way these things always happen, naturally, and then all at once. "You do look so like her, my lady," Agnes said, without quite meaning to. "Around the eyes especially. Cook noticed it on your very first day. Said it was like seeing a ghost walk through the front door." Clara turned a page. "Like who, Agnes?" The duster paused. She could feel the girl recalibrating, deciding how much she'd already said. "Lady Isabella, my lady. She was to marry his grace. Before she wasn't here anymore." "She died?" Clara asked. Agnes looked at the mantel, then the floor, then a point somewhere between the two. "That's what they said, my lady. That's what they said. Not, yes, she died. Not, yes, it was a tragedy. Just, that is what they said." Clara repeated the phrase in her mind all afternoon, the way you worry a loose thread. Gently. With no intention of pulling, not yet. She learned more over the days that followed. From Mr. Hollis, who became slightly more forthcoming when he thought he was being unhelpful. From the gardener, who had loved Isabella and made no effort to hide it. From the cook, who still prepared Isabella's favorite dishes on her birthday, a fact no one had mentioned, but which Clara had noticed in the menus. Lady Isabella Vane had been, by every account, extraordinary. Educated. Witty. Warm-hearted. The kind of woman who remembered every servant's name and their children's names and what village they came from. She had been engaged to the Duke for 3 years. The match had been both love and alliance, a combination increasingly rare in their world. Everyone had adored her. Including, apparently, the man who had married Clara instead. She had known, in the abstract, that society would be unkind. She had not prepared for the particular quality of that unkindness. Not cruel exactly. Not the blunt instrument of outright cruelty. Worse than that, exquisitely polite. Precise. The kind wielded by women who have spent lifetimes perfecting the art of wounding someone while maintaining an expression of serene concern. Lady Pembridge smiled warmly across the luncheon table and said, "My dear, how lovely. You know, from a certain angle, you really do remind one of Isabella. Something about the coloring, I think. Edmund always did have a type." Warm laughter moved around the table like a wave. Lady Weston leaned forward with gentle curiosity and asked, "Do you paint?" Isabella was a remarkable painter. Such extraordinary watercolors of the grounds. Clara sipped her tea. "I embroider," she said, "though I suspect the grounds would suffer for it." A brief, polite laugh. And then the conversation moved on. But it continued, in small cuts, for the rest of the afternoon. Isabella had been fluent in 4 languages. Isabella had ridden like a cavalry officer. Isabella had always known exactly what to say. Isabella had never looked uncertain at a crowded table. Isabella had never reached for her teacup with a hand that wasn't quite steady. On the carriage ride home, Clara sat with her hands folded in her lap and her spine perfectly straight and watched the winter fields go gray in the failing light. She thought, "I have been married 4 months to a man who never chose me. I live in a house that still mourns someone else. I am surrounded by people who look at me and see a copy." She did not cry. She had not cried since the night she made her decision in her parents' sitting room, and she did not think she would start now. But she closed her eyes for just a moment. And in the dark behind her eyelids, she made herself a different kind of promise, not the one she had made her family. "I will not be a replacement. I will be Clara. Whatever that costs." She started with the household accounts. Mrs. Fenwick presented them on her 3rd week, clearly expecting polite disinterest. Clara read them cover to cover. She found 3 separate discrepancies, a supplier who had been overcharging for grain for at least 2 years, and a whole category of estate maintenance that had been quietly deferred until the costs had become genuinely dangerous. She mentioned none of this to the Duke. She simply corrected it. She began learning the tenants' names. She visited the cottages, not in the grand ceremonial way of a duchess making an appearance, but practically, with questions and a notebook. A roof needed replacing. A well had turned brackish. Old Tom Beckwith, who had worked the orchards for 40 years, had a hip that hadn't been properly seen to because he couldn't afford the physician. Clara arranged all of it. Quietly. Without fanfare. She did not know the Duke had noticed until the afternoon she was in the kitchen garden with the head gardener. Her sleeves rolled to the elbow, her hair escaping its pins, listening to an explanation of why the south wall espalier had been failing. She glanced up because she had learned to feel when she was being observed. The Duke was standing at the far end of the path. Still in his riding coat, clearly direct from the stables. He was not looking at the wall. He was looking at her. She held his gaze for a moment. She couldn't read his expression. It was not the polite blankness he wore at dinner. It was something more complicated, the expression of a man recalculating something he thought he'd already decided. He gave her a single, precise nod, then walked on. That evening at dinner, he asked his first unprompted question. "The roof on Miller's farm," he said. "Was it your instruction?" "It was a danger," she said. The accounts had the funds. A pause. The accounts haven't had those funds in 3 years. They do now. I renegotiated the grain contract. He looked at her across the long table for a moment that lasted considerably longer than dinner conversation usually requires. I see, he said. He returned to his meal. But something had shifted between them. The air was different, not warm, not yet, but no longer simply cold. It had become something more interesting than cold. She had a key made. It cost her 3 favors and considerable patience with the elderly locksmith in the village, who had strong opinions about young duchesses wanting access to locked wings of their husbands' castles, and who shared those opinions freely and at considerable length. But she had the key. She went back on a Tuesday afternoon. The Duke was in the village on magistrate business. The senior staff were busy with the quarterly linen inventory. She brought a candle and her practical notebook and told herself she was simply gathering information. The portrait looked the same. Isabella looked the same, that serene, slightly too knowing expression, those dark eyes that seemed to follow you with patience rather than malice. Clara looked at her directly. "Who are you?" she said quietly. "Not what they tell me." "Who are you really?" The painted woman said nothing. Clara turned away and began examining the room properly. It was not empty, she realized. It had simply been cleared of personality. The furniture remained. A small writing desk. A chaise longue in faded green silk. A bookshelf with books arranged by color, which Clara immediately recognized as the arrangement of someone for whom books were both decoration and sustenance. The desk had 3 drawers. 2 were empty. The third contained a book. Small. Leather-bound. Deep burgundy. The kind a young woman of quality carries in her pocket or keeps beside her bed. A diary. Isabella's diary. Clara picked it up carefully, the way you pick up something old, aware that it might crumble. She sat at the desk. Opened it. The handwriting was beautiful. Elegant. Quick. Slightly impatient. The entries covered 2 years, Isabella's arrival at Blackthorne, her first impressions of the Duke, her initial wariness of an arrangement that was more business than love, and then, gradually, cautiously, the suggestion of something warmer beginning to grow. Clara read slowly, turning each page with care, and then she reached the last entry. The date was 18 months ago. The handwriting, usually so controlled, was jagged, pressed hard into the paper, as if the pen had been held by a hand that was shaking. She read 3 sentences, and then nothing. Not a conclusion. Not an ending. Just absence. Because the last page had been torn out. Not carefully. Urgently. The ragged white edge still there, raw at the seam. Someone had removed it. Recently enough that the paper still looked clean at the tear. What had been on that page? And who had torn it out, and why? She had prepared for 6 weeks. She had learned the seating arrangements, the family histories, the subtle alliances and older grudges that ran through the county's social fabric like fault lines. She had a gown of deep blue silk, understated by current standards, but perfectly fitted and quietly elegant. She had practiced her entries, her exits, the management of a receiving line. She had done everything right. She had not prepared for Lord Ashmore. He was 60, florid, the kind of man who had learned that rudeness can be dressed as wit and spent 4 decades refining the disguise. He caught her near the punch table at a moment when she was alone, which was, she would realize later, entirely deliberate. "The replacement Duchess," he said warmly. How extraordinary that Edmund managed to find one so similar. One wonders if he simply described Isabella to a catalogue and asked for something close. Appreciative laughter moved through the small circle around him. "Tell me," he continued, "does he call you by her name by accident? Or is it quite deliberate by now?" Clara felt every face in her vicinity orient toward her. She felt the silence spreading outward from his words like cold water. She felt the weight of being watched, all these people, all this history, all these expectations she had never been told about. She could respond with dignity, and still have lost. She could say nothing, and be noted for weakness. She could respond with anger, and have that follow her for 20 years. Or she could do what she did. She turned to Lord Ashmore with an expression of pleasant attentiveness. "Lord Ashmore," she said, "I've heard a great deal about your opinion of Lady Isabella. What I haven't yet heard is your opinion of your own behavior. I wonder which of the two is more instructive." She smiled, with her eyes and everything, then turned to his wife standing beside him. "Lady Ashmore, I believe they're about to open the buffet. Shall we?" Lady Ashmore looked at her with an expression of pure, startled respect, and took her arm. Clara thought that was the end of it. It wasn't. By midnight she had been excluded from 3 conversations in quick succession. She had overheard herself called the bargain bride by a woman who hadn't checked who was standing on the other side of a potted palm. And she had watched the Duke move through his own party without once looking for her, not unkindly. Simply with the focused efficiency of a man who had forgotten she was there. She stood alone on the edge of the ballroom floor at 11:15. Watched the dancers. Watched the candlelight catch on earrings and wine glasses and the laughter of people who belonged here. And thought, this is the rest of my life. Standing at the edge. Watching. Never quite belonging. She was wrong. But she didn't know that yet. She heard it from the doorway of the supper room. Lord Ashmore, still performing, still working the same material, emboldened now by wine and an audience, was describing Clara to a fresh group of listeners as a very reasonable imitation, for those who find the original unavailable. The laughter was immediate and warm. Clara stood in the doorway and made her decision. She was going to leave before she said something that would take 6 months to recover from. She turned to go. A hand closed around her wrist. Gently, but unmistakably. She turned. The Duke stood directly behind her. He had come from nowhere, or rather, from close enough that he had heard everything Ashmore said. His expression was not quite readable, but his eyes were very, very still. The kind of stillness that precedes a great deal of motion. He kept his hand on her wrist, not restraining, but holding, and walked her into the supper room. Lord Ashmore looked up. His expression moved through several stages. "Ashmore," the Duke said. "Just the name. Perfectly level. I believe you were speaking of my wife." Lord Ashmore attempted to recover. "I was simply observing. You were being unpleasant at a gathering she has worked 6 weeks to prepare. In my house. To my wife." The silence in the room shifted quality. Not the amused, anticipatory silence of society enjoying a spectacle. The taut, uncomfortable silence of people watching a line being drawn. "The Duchess of Blackthorne," the Duke said, "is not a replacement for anyone. She is precisely who she is. Those who require further clarification are welcome to seek another evening and another host." He offered Clara his arm. She took it. In the corridor, he released her. Turned to face her. "Thank you," she said. "A beat." He was being an ass, the Duke said. Clara's mouth did something it hadn't done in weeks. It almost smiled. "Yes," she agreed. He was. There was an oddly comfortable silence where neither of them spoke and neither of them walked away. Then the Duke said, quietly, "You handled Ashmore better than I expected. The bit about his own behavior." "I was going to mention his hair," Clara said. "But I thought that was excessive." He looked at her for a full 3 seconds. And then, briefly, quietly, like a door opening onto a room that had been sealed for a very long time, the Duke of Blackthorne smiled. 3 days after the ball, Clara was in the village, at the physician's surgery on estate business, when she overheard a conversation that was not intended for her. Dr. Harcastle was old enough to have been practicing in this village for longer than most of its current residents had been alive. He was discreet, he had to be, carrying 3 generations of secrets. But his study door was ajar. And Clara was in the waiting room. And the voices were not lowered quite enough. His voice first, "I did what I was instructed to do. But if anyone ever examines the parish records with sufficient care," and then Mr. Hollis, "no one is going to examine the parish records. The new Duchess," Dr. Harcastle said, "strikes me as precisely the sort of person who examines things with sufficient care." A pause. Then Hollis, "Isabella is gone. What's done is done." "Is she gone?" Harcastle said. Or did we simply agree to say so? Clara did not move. She stood in the waiting room and listened to the sound of a chair being pushed back, and then the sound of footsteps, and then Mr. Hollis appeared in the doorway and stopped when he saw her. She gave him her most pleasant, most vacant smile. Mr. Hollis. What a coincidence. I was just here about the estate supply contract. The old one expired. He looked at her for a moment longer than comfort allows. Of course, my lady, he said. And left. Clara sat back down, folded her hands in her lap, thought very carefully about the precise words she had just heard. Is she gone? Or did we simply agree to say so? Isabella did not die. She disappeared. And someone, perhaps several someones, had agreed to say otherwise. That night, she returned to her rooms to find them disturbed. She knew immediately. She was the kind of person who knew where everything was, not obsessively, simply because she paid attention. And attention to small things is its own form of protection. The books on her desk had been moved. Her writing box had been opened and not replaced at exactly the angle she always kept it. A drawer in her nightstand was an inch too far closed. Someone had been through her room. She moved through it calmly, cataloging the disturbance. Then she checked the place she had hidden the diary, wrapped in a petticoat at the back of her wardrobe, behind her winter cloaks. Gone. Then she noticed the note. On her pillow. A single slip of paper, folded once. No seal. No handwriting she recognized. She opened it. Slow and deliberate. Stop looking. What is buried for good reason. The next warning will not be a note. Clara read it twice. Folded it back precisely along its original crease. Placed it in her pocket. She sat on the edge of her bed for a long time. She had a choice. She could stop. She could decide this was not her business, that she had married a title and a castle and a duty, not a mystery. That whatever Isabella's story was, it was not her story, and she had no obligation to follow it into the dark. She could be sensible. She almost was. And then she thought about Isabella's handwriting, quick, impatient, pressing hard into the paper. About a woman who had sat at a desk in a cold room and written something so urgent that the final page had to be torn out. She thought about Dr. Harcastle's voice. Is she gone? Or did we simply agree to say so? Clara stood, changed her dress, sat at her own desk, opened her practical notebook, wrote at the top of a fresh page, "What do I actually know?" and began. The Dowager Duchess arrived 3 days later. Lady Margaret Blackthorne, 70 years old. Elegant in the way of people who have spent a lifetime believing that ruthlessness is simply good management. She descended from her carriage in a gown that cost more than a tenant farmer earned in a year, and looked at Clara the way a jeweler looks at a stone of uncertain provenance. "You're shorter than I expected," she said. "You're exactly as I expected, my lady," Clara replied. Something moved behind the dowager's eyes. Surprise. A recalculation. The adjustment of a woman who had expected less. "Edmund always did have unexpected taste," she said finally. The visit was, on the surface, perfectly civil. Appropriate questions. Appropriate answers. A gracious if reserved mother-in-law meeting a son's new wife. Nothing to alarm a casual observer. But Clara watched her. She watched the way the dowager's eyes moved when the East Wing was mentioned. The slightly too controlled neutrality of her expression whenever Isabella's name came up. The way she watched Clara, not with dislike, exactly, but with the focused attention of someone assessing a risk. And the way she arranged to speak privately with Mr. Hollis for nearly an hour on her very first afternoon. That evening, Clara wrote in her notebook, "She knows. About all of it. She may have arranged most of it." She underlined the word arranged. Then sat back and thought about a woman powerful enough to make an entire person disappear from the official record. And wondered, very quietly, what exactly she had walked into by marrying into this family. Despite everything, despite the locked room and the torn diary and the note on her pillow and the sense of walls closing in from directions she hadn't yet identified, something quiet and entirely unexpected was happening between Clara and the Duke. It didn't announce itself. That was the thing. It accumulated, Instead, the way mornings accumulate into a life. Slowly. And then undeniably. It was in the conversations at dinner that had stopped being polite and started being actual. He had opinions about estate management that surprised her, more progressive than she'd expected. She had observations about people that clearly interested him. He read the same historians she did, disagreed about two of them, and was right about one and wrong about the other. She told him so. He argued. She held her ground. He conceded, briefly, grudgingly, but genuinely. He began appearing in places she happened to be, without clear purpose. The library, where he had never appeared before her arrival. The kitchen garden on 2 separate occasions. And once, memorably, the village market, where he stood slightly awkwardly among the stalls with the expression of a man who had walked somewhere without entirely meaning to. "Are you following me?" she asked. "I had business in the village," he said. "At the cheese counter?" He looked at the cheese counter. "Bought some cheese." "Yes," he said. She laughed. Genuinely. Unguardedly. She hadn't laughed like that in longer than she could remember, and it startled her when it happened. It seemed to startle him too. He looked at her as if she had done something unexpected, and entirely worth looking at. These were not the gestures of a man in love. Not yet. They were the gestures of a man who had decided, quietly and without fanfare, that the woman he had married was someone he actually wanted to know. That was different from love. But it was also, Clara thought, the foundation without which love cannot safely be built. She thought about this more than she wanted to. She also thought, with the practical part of her mind that never entirely switched off, "I still don't know who you are." Not completely. And there is a woman somewhere, alive, possibly, who you were supposed to love instead. She worked through the parish records over 3 separate afternoons. The Blackthorne church kept records going back 200 years. Births, marriages, deaths, the ordinary machinery of community existence, recorded in a succession of large books in handwriting ranging from meticulous to barely legible. She told the vicar she was compiling a family history for the Duke's records. He was delighted by this. Brought her tea. Left her completely alone. Exactly what she needed. She worked backwards from 2 years ago. She did not find what she was looking for in the death records. She did not find it in the marriage records. She found it in the birth records. A child. Registered 18 months ago. Under a mother's name that had been partially obscured, clearly intentionally, but not obscured quite well enough for someone paying close attention. Alongside it, the father's designation listed simply as, a gentleman of Blackthorne. Clara stared at this entry for a long time. A child. Born 18 months ago. Registered in a village 30 miles from Blackthorne. To a mother whose name had been deliberately erased from the record. By a hand more careful than the one that had written it. Everyone had assumed Isabella had no children. The estate records mentioned no heir. The Duke had never spoken of a child. Not once. Clara wrote slowly in her notebook, "Isabella had a child. The child exists. Where is the child?" She sat in the cold church with the old books around her and the weight of other people's secrets settled on her hands. A child changes everything. A child is not an old scandal that can be managed from a distance. A child is a person. A child, in this family, with this title. A child is an heir. She rode out early the following morning. She had a favorite route through the estate, north through the grounds, past the old mill, along the ridge above the lake, and back down through the wood. She rode it alone, which Mrs. Fenwick disapproved of, and which the Duke had never directly commented on, though she suspected he knew. Her horse was called Mercutio. Young and occasionally dramatic, and she had, against all expectation, grown genuinely fond of him. They were on the ridge path, the narrowest section, where the ground drops sharply to the left and there is nothing below but a 30-foot fall to the lake shore, when Mercutio shied. Not the ordinary shying of a young horse startled by a bird. This was sudden and absolute. A full rear, front hooves leaving the ground, a sound of pure equine panic. Clara had ridden since childhood. Her body responded before her mind did. She pressed down and forward, hands soft, keeping contact. But the path was narrow. Mercutio's hindquarters swung left toward the drop, and there was nothing on the left, just air. She grabbed mane. Threw her weight right. For 2 seconds that lasted considerably longer, she genuinely did not know which way they were going. They went right. Both of them, in an undignified heap on the solid path. She sat in the mud for a moment, breathing. Then she got up, calmed Mercutio with a hand and a low voice, and looked back at the path. There was a wire across it, thin, nearly invisible against the brown earth. Stretched low and taut between 2 stakes, at exactly the height to catch a horse's fetlock. The stakes had been driven that morning. The ground around them was freshly disturbed. Someone had known she rode this route. Someone had known this path. Someone had arranged this with a particular knowledge of a person who understood horses, and heights, and this estate's geography very well. Someone wanted her dead. Or at least wanted to send a message considerably more urgent than a note on her pillow. Clara removed the wire, coiled it carefully, put it in her saddlebag, rode home. Did not go to the Duke. Not yet. She needed to think. She needed to understand the full shape of what she was facing before she decided who, if anyone, she could trust. She worked through the night. She spread everything across her desk. Her notebook. The coil of wire. 2 letters she had collected from places they had not been carefully enough concealed. A copy of the birth record, made in her own hand. She assembled the pieces the way she assembled the household accounts, methodically, patiently, without forcing the shape before it was ready to reveal itself. And the shape that emerged was this. Isabella Vane had been engaged to the Duke. In the final year of their engagement, she had become pregnant. The child, a son, Clara believed, based on a fragment of a letter, had been born in secret, registered under obscured names, and removed from the estate. Isabella herself had disappeared shortly after. The story given to the world, Isabella had died. A fever. Vague, sad, and final. The truth, she had been alive at the time of her disappearance. The child was alive. Both had been removed from the official record by people with both the motivation and the means to do so. She thought about who had the means. The Dowager Duchess had managed this estate for 30 years. She knew every clerk, every vicar, every person with access to official records. She had money, authority, and the particular ruthlessness of a woman who had always believed the dynasty was more important than any individual within it. She thought about the motivation. An heir kept secret was a threat to everything. A duchess who died quietly could be mourned and replaced. A duchess who was alive somewhere, with a child who had a claim to the Blackthorne title, that was a different matter entirely. And then Clara thought of something that turned the whole picture inside out. The Duke. What did Edmund know? Had he known Isabella was alive? Had he participated in her disappearance? Had he married Clara knowing the mother of his child was out there somewhere? Or had he been deceived, too? She sat with that question for a long time. Longer than was comfortable. She realized, with the quiet clarity of a person being honest with themselves, that the answer was the most important thing in the world to her right now. And not only because of what it meant for the investigation. She had arranged the confrontation carefully. After 2 weeks of observation, she knew the time and place where the Dowager and Mr. Hollis held their private conversations. She positioned herself beforehand, brought her notebook, and this time, she heard everything. The Dowager's voice, clipped and precise. The arrangements with the family in Edinburgh who were raising the boy. The instructions given to Dr. Harcastle 18 months ago. The letter sent to Isabella, generous, by the Dowager's reckoning. A house. A monthly income. The complete severing of any connection to the Blackthorne name. And then, the marriage arrangement with Clara. Chosen, the Dowager explained, with the logic of a chess player who plans 6 moves ahead. A woman, she said, who looks similar enough that Edmund's grief has somewhere to attach. A woman with enough intelligence to manage the estate, but without connections powerful enough to ask dangerous questions. A woman with enough debt in her family that she would agree, and be grateful. A woman, Clara thought, pressing her pen hard into the page, who was supposed to be too busy being grateful to notice. Edmund knows nothing, the dowager continued. He grieved Isabella sincerely. I admit I hadn't anticipated how deep that would run. I had thought the attachment more formal than feeling. But his grief was managed. And now he has this new wife, and if she can be kept from digging. She's already digging, Mr. Hollis said. She found the birth record. Silence. How much does she know? Enough to be dangerous. Long pause. Clara moved from her position carefully. Silently. With the expertise of someone who had been moving through other people's conversations her entire life. She walked directly to the Duke's study. Knocked twice. He told her to come in. She came in. Closed the door. Placed her notebook on his desk. He looked at her. Something in her expression made him go very still. I need you to read this, she said. And then I need you to tell me, truthfully, how much of it you already knew. He read it. She watched his face the entire time. She had steeled herself for anger, denial, the blankness of a man caught in something he had chosen. She had not steeled herself for what actually happened. The blood left his face. Slowly. Completely. He read the pages again. Then he sat back in his chair and looked at the ceiling and said nothing for a long moment. I didn't know, he said finally. About the child. I didn't know she was alive. I was told she died. I was given a grave to visit. He stopped. I was told she died. Clara watched him for a long moment. And then, because she believed that truth deserved to be met directly. She has a son, Clara said. Your son. He is 18 months old and living in Edinburgh, and he does not know his own name. The Duke closed his eyes. That evening, he found her in the East Wing. She hadn't meant to come here. Her feet had simply brought her, the way feet sometimes know where to go before the mind has decided. She stood in front of Isabella's portrait in the cold room, a single candle in her hand, and looked at this woman she had never met. This woman whose shape had been traced over with Clara's name. She heard him come in. He stood beside her. Close enough that she was aware of him, but not close enough to touch. They looked at the portrait together in silence for a while. I have been very unfair to you, he said. Clara said nothing. I thought I was grieving a woman I loved. I was grieving a story I had been told. Looking back, I'm not certain how much of what I felt was for Isabella herself, and how much was for the idea of her. The woman my mother chose for me to love. Presented in exactly the right way. At exactly the right time. He paused. I never truly knew her. We had 3 years of a formal arrangement. We spoke at parties. We corresponded. I admired her. Perhaps I loved the admiring. You are not like her, he said. Clara waited. You are nothing like her. You are difficult and stubborn, and you ask questions that make people deeply uncomfortable, and you renegotiate grain contracts and ride alone on dangerous paths and apparently investigate family conspiracies in your spare time. A beat. You are also the only person in this house who has dealt with me honestly since the day you arrived. The only person who has not managed me or handled me or decided in advance what I needed to know. He looked at her directly. The candlelight did something to his expression that made him look younger, and more tired, and more human than she had ever seen him. I didn't marry you to replace her. My mother arranged this marriage for her own reasons, reasons we now fully understand. But I stayed in it. I came to dinner. I followed you to the cheese counter. And I think those were different reasons entirely. Clara felt something shift in her chest. Something that had been carefully held in place, beginning, quietly, to let go. Edmund, she said. It was the first time she had used his name. Not his title. Not a careful form of address. Just his name. He looked at her. What are we going to do about the child? The way she said it, the way it assumed they were a we, made him exhale. Long and slow. The breath of a man who has been holding something very heavy for a very long time. We are going to bring him home, he said. He was extraordinarily good at consequence. He called a formal gathering with 2 weeks' notice and said only that it concerned a matter of estate and family significance. The right people came, the magistrate, 2 county justices, the vicar, the most prominent families in the county, and the Dowager Duchess, who had been given no reason to suspect what was coming. Clara sat beside her husband at the head of the room. The Duke spoke without raising his voice and without any drama. He laid out every fact. The birth record, the arrangements made with Edinburgh, the recovered letters, the instructions given to Dr. Harcastle, the wire across the ridge path, the stolen diary, the note left on his wife's pillow. The room was very quiet. The Dowager Duchess sat through all of it with the composed expression of a woman who had prepared for this possibility, but not for this quality of evidence. Her face remained still, but something moved through her eyes that Clara had not seen there before. Fear. Lady Pembridge, who had called Clara the replacement Duchess at that first luncheon, went the color of old paper. Lord Ashmore studied his shoes. The Dowager spoke once, at the very end. "I did what was necessary for this family." And the Duke said, equally composed, "You did what you believed was necessary for the dynasty. There is a difference. The family includes the child you removed, the woman you exiled, and the wife you deceived. The dynasty is a building. I choose the family." She had no answer for that. The Duke's son arrived from Edinburgh 3 weeks later. His name, the woman raising him had been told, was James. He was a year and a half old, dark-haired, with his father's eyes and his mother's quiet patience. He looked around the great hall of Blackthorne Castle with the concentrated curiosity of someone encountering a very interesting problem. Clara watched the Duke meet his son for the first time. She did not cry. She was not, as a rule, a crier. She came very close. He asked her to be there. Not commanded. Asked. She stood beside him in the cold room as the footmen moved through it, carefully and systematically removing the things that had turned this space into a shrine. The furniture went to storage. The drapes came down. The bookshelf was dismantled. The portrait was last. 2 footmen carried it carefully. It was a well-made painting, and he had instructed that it be treated with respect. It was to go to the family archive, not destroyed. Isabella had been real. She deserved to be remembered honestly, not as an icon or an absence, but as a woman who had been wronged by the same family that had wronged Clara, and who had, somewhere, continued living. They were trying to find her. Hollis had given them a name, a village in the south of France where a woman matching Isabella's description had been known to live. They had sent correspondence. They had not yet had a reply. The portrait went through the door. The room was empty. Clara looked at the bare wall. The stone behind where the painting had hung was slightly lighter, a ghost of a ghost. The Duke left for 10 minutes. He returned with 2 footmen carrying something large wrapped in cloth. They hung it on the wall. Stepped back. Unwrapped it. A portrait. Clara. Painted by the artist who had come to the castle 6 weeks earlier under the pretense of documenting the grounds. She looked at herself, not as she performed herself for society, but as she apparently looked when she didn't know she was being observed. Reading, with her sleeves rolled and her hair escaping its pins, sitting in the kitchen garden with the sunlight on her face and her notebook on her knee. The expression on the face in the portrait was one she barely recognized. She looked happy. "Mrs. Fenwick told the painter to find you at your most natural," the Duke said. "I believe she chose her moment carefully." "I look like I don't know I'm being watched," Clara said. "Yes," he said. "It's very accurate." She turned to look at him. He was looking at the portrait with an expression that had nothing complicated in it at all. Just the expression of a man looking at something he is genuinely glad exists. "Edmund," she said quietly. "Yes." "I am not in love with you yet. I want to be precise about that. But I think I am going in that direction. Steadily. And I thought you should know." He looked at her. Was quiet for long enough that she began to question the wisdom of precision. And then, "I am considerably further along that road than steadily," he said. "I thought you should know that, too." Pause. Let it breathe. The cold room was warmer than it had ever been. 3 months later. Spring arrived at Blackthorne Castle the way spring arrives at old places, slowly, and then all at once. The yew trees hadn't changed, but they seemed less severe somehow. The fountain worked again. The kitchen garden was producing. The south wall espalier was showing new growth. James was walking, unsteadily, with the magnificent confidence of a toddler who has absolutely no awareness of his own fragility. He had adopted Clara immediately and without ceremony, following her through rooms with the single-minded focus of someone who has identified a favorite. He called her something that was probably meant to be her name and hadn't quite got there yet, and she found she didn't mind at all. A letter had come from France, that Isabella's letter. Brief, careful, written by a woman who had been surviving for a long time and had learned to say a great deal in very few words. She was not ready to come back. She was not sure she would ever be. But she was glad her son was at Blackthorne. She was glad he had a father who was looking for her. At the end of the letter, in her quick, slightly impatient handwriting, she had written one line about Clara. "Tell the Duchess I hope she is well. From what I hear, she earned that title." Clara handed the Duke the letter in the garden that afternoon. He read it slowly. She watched the light change on his face as he did, the old grief moving through him, finally, like weather. Moving through and settling somewhere quieter. He folded the letter, then looked at her. "I spent 2 years standing in that room," he said, "looking at that portrait, trying to feel the shape of something I thought I'd lost." He paused. "And then you arrived. And you were so relentlessly, exhaustingly, magnificently yourself. And I kept waiting for that to stop." He looked at her. "It never did. I thought I was searching for someone I had lost," he said. He reached for her hand. "Instead, I found someone I never deserved." Clara looked at him. At this man she had agreed to marry to save her family, who had been cold and distant and complicated and gradually, undeniably, completely worth knowing. She said, with a precise honesty she had always believed was its own form of love, "You deserve rather more than you think. You just needed someone to tell you while renegotiating the grain contract." He laughed. A real laugh, the kind she had only heard a handful of times, and had been collecting like something rare. He held her hand. She let him. She had come to this house as a transaction. A signature on a document that erased her family's debts and replaced a woman she had never met. She had been called the replacement duchess. The bargain bride. A very reasonable imitation. But here is what no one in that ballroom understood, what the dowager never calculated for, what even the Duke himself had not yet fully grasped on the night he whispered those 7 terrible words into an empty room. A replacement is a copy. A stand-in. A placeholder until the real thing returns. Clara Ashford, Clara Blackthorne, was none of those things. She was the woman who walked into a broken house and quietly, methodically, without being asked, began to fix it. She was the woman who renegotiated the grain contract and replaced the roof and learned every tenant's name and protected the workers and found the diary and followed the wire and sat through the cold and the loneliness and the comparison and the humiliation, and did not become small. She was the woman who, when she found the truth, did not run from it. She brought it to the man who needed to hear it most. She was never Isabella's replacement. She was the woman who came after the story ended. And the beginning of the true one. Long final pause.